My name is, sorry, yeah, everybody get that? Got it. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Gelstrup, and I am a member of Mothers Out Front. Mothers Out Front is a national organization of mothers and others who are working to ensure a livable climate and a just transition to a clean energy future for all children. The Cambridge chapter of Mothers Out Front has organized this evening's community forum about an important policy in Cambridge, the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, also known as BEUDO, which covers large buildings in the city. For over a year, the city has been considering amendments to this ordinance. These amendments would require large buildings to not only report their greenhouse gas emissions, but also reduce them over a period of time. We want to provide you with an opportunity for our community to learn about BEUDO and the amendments being considered, and also to hear about the health implications of greenhouse gas emissions. Our purpose this evening is educational. We want to explore some of the health impacts of greenhouse gas emissions and the nuts and bolts of the proposed BEUDO amendments. We hope that you find our forum informative. We would like to thank the Cambridge Somerville node of 350.org for co-sponsoring this forum, as well as Green Cambridge, Cambridge Residents Alliance, Elders Climate Action, First Parish's Environmental Justice Task Force, and the Earth Justice Ministry of Old Cambridge Baptist Church for promoting this event. First, we will hear from Dr. Gaurub Basu of the Cambridge Health Alliance, whom I will introduce in a moment, followed by a time for questions related to his talk. Then we will hear from Seth Federspiel of the City of Cambridge Community Development Department, again, followed by time for questions related to his presentation. We expect to have time at the end of the forum for general Q&A. We are thrilled that so many of you have joined us this evening. I would like to recognize several elected officials who are joining us. Cambridge City Councilors Patty Nolan, Paul Toner, and Quentin Zondervan. Massachusetts State Representatives Steve Owens, Dave Rogers, and Dan Ryan, and Senator William Brownsberger. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us. In order for this forum to go smoothly, we would like everyone to follow some guidelines. Please rename yourself in participants in Zoom with your full name and organizational affiliation, if any. Unless you're actively asking a question, please mute yourself. If you don't, we will do it for you. Use the raise hand function in Zoom to ask a question. No need to put your hand up. You will find that action under the round smiley face reactions icon at the bottom of your screen. If you're on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. Questions to speakers should be about their presentations, not other topics. There will be time set aside for general Q&A at the end. Questions will be limited to 30 seconds. I'll be keeping time, so if you're exceeding your time, I'll ask you to finish your question, give you a few more seconds to wrap up, and then we'll have to mute you. We have limited time and want lots of people to be able to ask questions and hear answers from our expert presenters. We will be recording this forum, so if you don't want your image to be seen, please turn off your video. We'll try to answer simple clarification questions in the chat. And finally, we also plan to follow up with an email to all of you with informational links related to some of tonight's topics. We're hoping that everyone can help us keep to these guidelines, and we're looking forward to a really interesting evening. So with no further ado, let me introduce Dr. Gaurub Basu. Dr. Basu is a physician and founding co-director of the Cambridge Health Alliance Center for Health Equity, Education, and Advocacy. He is also an instructor at Harvard Medical School, where he is lead faculty of climate curriculum, has co-directed the social medicine course, and has served on the task force to address racism. Dr. Basu has been recognized nationally and received numerous awards for his work in medical education, climate change, and health equity. His work and opinion pieces have appeared in the Boston Globe, Scientific America, Grist, NPR, WBUR, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, among others. He was part of the Cambridge Climate Crisis Working Group and the Net Zero Action Plan Task Force. Please welcome Dr. Basu to our community forum.
Hello, hello. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight, and appreciate all your work and all the leaders and representatives out there. I'm really grateful to join you all. So I'm hoping folks can see my screen. Yeah, can I get a thumbs up? All right, great. And let me share my slides. All right, so I'll go for about 20 minutes or so. Again, my name is Gaurav Basu. I'm a primary care doctor, and I've been working in this kind of intersection of climate and health, and particularly health equity. And I think education is a valuable vehicle because it allows us to build community. So I appreciate the emphasis on community building and education tonight. I've got to start by showing my own mom. I love moms, and the reason I value when Mothers Up Front has done so much is because you've been able to carry the moral courage that comes from these kind of relationships and this commitment to intergenerational justice. For me, you know, in my work, I try to carry, I think, a parallel message about health. I think health is about seeing people's humanity, and it allows us to see the deeper core parts of who we are. And so if we are committed to this notion that everyone deserves excellent health, everyone deserves access to healthcare, well, that's going to bring us together and create a social contract in what we need to do. You know, I've been working on projects I think are important for most of my career, but I had my own awakening of climate change only in 2018 with the IPCC report that year. I came to many of you in the audience actually to seek counsel and realized for me that climate change really was fundamentally an issue of health and health equity, and that actually being a doctor and speaking to the connections to health was a critical piece of this, and I would argue is underspoken to in our public discourse. And so now there's really been an awakening among my colleagues, I think, in the last few years, and it's really heartening to see the kind of community that's building inside medical communities to really bring this to the forefront. And we were excited to get news that we're a formal theme at the medical school, and we're just seeing a lot of people really commit to this. So just to touch upon this briefly, you all know some of these outlines, but nationally, this is the EPA shows us the different areas of greenhouse gas emissions. Today, we'll be focusing a lot of the conversation on building-based emissions. And I was asked to speak a little broadly about the connections of climate change and health, which usually, obviously will take a long time. So I'll give some overview, speak to a couple of those mechanisms, and then focus in a little bit on the issues of indoor air pollution and building-based health issues. So, the numbers are staggering. There was a recent Annals of Internal Medicine statement that came out, a position statement that did a really nice literature review, I think, and showed that modifiable environmental factors contribute to 24% of global deaths and 28% of death of children under 5. That 40% of the US population lives in areas of unhealthy air pollution because of particulate matter and ground level ozone. And the Lancet Countdown is a really helpful guide. It came out in the fall, was showing that climate change can increase the incidence of nearly 60% of global infectious diseases. And so I kind of think of climate change and the burning of fossil fuels impacting health equity by 8 major mechanisms. Its impact on natural disasters and extreme weather, food insecurity, water scarcity, infectious diseases, heat-related diseases, air pollution, mental health, and forced migration, and critically, I think, its impact on human conflict. And so I'm going to, for today's purposes, touch upon heat and air pollution, which I think locally are things that I think a lot about for my patients. And I think we need a healthcare system that's more nimble and responsive to issues of heat waves that we're seeing every summer and air pollution. So often we'll kind of make a few data points of each one of these, but we'll focus because of time on just these 2. Before I go into those mechanisms, let me just say a word about how climate change lies at the intersection of environmental justice and structural racism. Many of us in medicine are really inspired by the words by Dr. Kamara Jones, who has been a pioneer in the work of racism and health. She defines racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, such that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole of society through the waste of human resources. And so every time I read this definition of structural racism, I immediately think about climate change. I don't know how you can't, because it is unfairly disadvantaging some and advantaging others and sapping the vitality of all of our human society. And here's a study that I think is really striking, is that Jeremy Hoffman back in 2020 did a study looking at redline communities, looked at 108 different communities, and was able to find, while controlling for other variables, that redline communities were 2.6 degrees Celsius hotter than non-redline communities. And you all in the audience here today know that's a very significant amount of heat. We'll talk a little bit more about the heat impacts on health, but we've got to connect the dots between the histories and the history and the present of the structures and the impacts that are happening in our hospitals and clinics. Lancet also documented that in redline communities, there's more oil and gas wells, higher levels of air pollution, less tree canopies and green space, and higher temperatures like we just spoke about. And these aren't just, this isn't just a conversation about our country or the world. This is happening here in Cambridge. And so this is city data that's showing the areas that flood more. And you can see at our baseline 2030 and 20 into the future, that it is the poorer communities, the community of color, here Alewife, you can see how they're disproportionately impacted by the impacts of flooding. Here we see the impacts of heat islands, which of course is decreased green space and tree canopies, causing the same hot day to disproportionately impact and heat different neighborhoods differently. And you can see again that the distribution of this is not equally felt throughout our community right here. So while we pride ourselves on our progressive vision and our commitment to climate action, we've got a lot of work to do. And this is nothing to say this is a slide on East Boston. When you see the disparities between Cambridge and Chelsea and East Boston, where many of my patients come from, the inequities and injustices are even more dramatic. Okay, so let's talk about heat briefly. So this is my hospital, and I had a patient. So a 30-year-old male who came to the United States, had a history of asthma, had moved to the United States from Central America, where he was a farmer. He was a parent of a young child, and his family was kind of nudging him because he was having upper respiratory symptoms, having kind of a common cold, but then it was increasingly, he was developing shortness of breath. Orthopnea means he was feeling short of breath when he was lying down, headache and fatigue, and he was really starting to not feel well. And so there might be some clinicians in the audience, but for those of you who are not, he came to the hospital and had a dramatic and devastating diagnosis. He was found to have acute on chronic renal failure. So his kidneys had failed, and not only had they kind of failed over a long period of time, but his kidneys were in kind of acute crisis. So he had to be hospitalized and put on immediate dialysis. So he's a young man who was healthy, came to the hospital believing that he was in full health. And this obviously just completely upended his life and his family's life. After a detailed evaluation, he didn't have diabetes or blood pressure, things that we think about with kidney disease. He was found to have something called CKDU, which is a phenomenon that we're increasingly understanding and learning about. Particularly, there's a striking paper or a piece about individuals in Nepal. A lot of my patients from Central America, such as this patient, is patients that we think about. But he was a farmer back home. He was out in the heat, providing food and nourishment for his community, but putting his own body at risk because his body was exposed to severe chronic heat. And so what can happen is you get dehydrated, that decreases the blood flow to your kidneys, and slowly your kidneys are getting injured, acute kidney injuries, we call it, day in and day out over the course of 5, 10, 15 years. such that your kidneys are getting injured slowly and compensating until they can't anymore. And then unfortunately, you have to have lifelong dialysis. So it is a dramatic and very difficult diagnosis. We're doing our best to take care of him, but it was a very, very disheartening situation. I'm not going to go in this great detail. The point I want to make is that heat really impacts the fundamentals of our physiology. And when our body is getting hot, just like the planet has a delicate equilibrium, of course, our body has a delicate equilibrium of what temperature allows our enzymes and cascades to work properly. So our body can compensate for it by increasing our cardiac output, our heart rate, getting a blood flow when we're too hot. But at some point, it can't keep up anymore. And that's when it becomes decompensated. And that's when you get cellular death, you get, your GI system not working properly, cardiovascular system can't keep up. And then there's a real inflammatory process that happens that can be very, very dangerous. So this is really kind of a slide on heat stroke. But heat really impacts, even if it doesn't get to the point of heat stroke, it impacts all the things I care about as a doctor. It increases strokes and heart attacks, respiratory disease, really every organ system we can think about. This was a study that came out in 2020. It was a JAMA piece, meta-analysis that showed that, and I want to share this particularly with this group, but it's a study I present in every one of my presentations because I think it's so concerning. It showed the association of both air pollution and heat on premature birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth in the United States, and did in a sub-analysis show that Black people are disproportionately impacted. So these are one of the things that really, keeps me up at night and I think makes us, challenges us that we must expect more of ourselves. This again is data from the city. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but you can see at baseline how many days over 90 degrees we have every year in the orange, and then in the hot red over 100. You can see how much that increases to 2030 and into the future. And so we've got a lot of work to do. The first time I saw this, I was really taken by it and really in distress. But the impacts of heat, the Northeast is the hottest warming, or the fastest warming quadrant of the United States. So the impacts of heat are serious and important here. A few words about air pollution. So globally, a striking number, 1 out of 5 premature deaths, a staggering 8.7 million deaths can be attributed to exposure to air pollution. And locally here, that translates to 2,800 deaths a year, 15,000 asthma cases a year, and 300 underweight births. All right, let's turn to air pollution, and I'm going to turn it over to Seth after my question and answer, but we're here to talk about buildings. So of course, we're thinking about the impacts of emissions from buildings, and we need to be thinking about how we can sustain healthy indoor spaces, because we spend more time indoors than outdoors, but we actually don't talk and think, I think, enough about the impacts of indoor air pollution. So a few studies here showed that renters in multifamily homes, 78% of the air pollution exposure was indoor versus 22% outdoor. Nitrogen dioxide is something we'll talk about a little bit here. You can see the disproportionality, 21 parts per billion outdoor, while 50 parts per billion indoor in Boston public housing. An important point here is that the EPA, obviously Clean Air Act, has done a really remarkable job of regulating outdoor air pollution. It's saved, I think it's been one of the policies that saved the most lives in federal policy, but the EPA has no mandate to address indoor air pollution. And so if you ask that we are exposed to more indoor air pollution indoor than outdoor, I think it really behooves us to have regulations for the same impacts of air pollution indoor. And it's also complicated. There was a study in 2014 showing that if we want to be increasing energy efficiency and creating strong envelopes around our homes, but without ventilation, that can actually increase indoor air pollution. So we've got to be working not only to increase efficiency, decreasing pollutants, but also improving ventilation, which is also on another thread important for issues of COVID, et cetera. All right, so nitrogen dioxide is an important pollutant for everyone to know, because that's at the middle of this conversation of indoor air pollution. This is a nice graphic from Rocky Mountain Institute. And so you can see, particularly for children, there's been increasing studies about nitrogen dioxide's impact on cognitive impacts, on learning deficits, and respiratory is probably the biggest thing that's studied. So it has a significant impact on respiratory pulmonary inflammation, and also has impacts on our cardiovascular system as well. So I'll probably just highlight those. All right, I'll run through a couple quick studies here. Let me just check on time. All right, I got a few minutes here, so I'll go quickly. But I think you all have been following. It's been in the news a lot. It's been pretty interesting and remarkable that there's been a national conversation about stoves and indoor air pollution and asthma. But this isn't new information. I'm seeing people like John Levy and other folks who've been working on these issues for a long time saying, I'm glad everyone's talking about this, but here's the studies I did decades ago. This is one study from 2013 that's often referenced, that a meta-analysis showed that children in homes with gas stoves had a 42% increase of asthma symptoms and a 24% increase of lifetime asthma diagnosis. And then this was the big one, right? This is the one that really stirred the recent conversation. I think they're doing a really impressive job of educating the public right now, but showed that 12.7% of childhood asthma cases nationally can be attributed to exposure to gas stoves. Harvard Sea Change, where I'm a health equity fellow, I was not involved in this study, but very smart people were, who showed, I think many of you have seen the study, that up to 21 really dangerous toxins found in kitchens with gas stoves around the Boston area, including things like benzene, which are concern us about their capacity to cause cancer in people exposed to it. And then the Stanford study that came out last year showing that more than 3/4 of methane emissions happen while the stove is turned off. So if we think that all of this is happening only when the stove is turned off, in fact, most of the methane leaks, which you all know is a super pollutant up to 90 times more potent than carbon dioxide, happen even when the stove is off. All right, so I don't know how you all feel. Sometimes when I ram through difficult study after difficult study after difficult study, I realize, oh, I dropped a dire message here. But I think I'm able to do that to this community because it's full of resilience and determination and a vision of something different. And so I think what the dramatic scope and scale of climate change and the work we have in front of us causes us to do that deep work, to have vision of a healthy and just future that challenges us to recreate all that we have created. We didn't make it right. Goes back to Dr. Jones's definition of structural racism, that some people benefited from the way we did things and other people didn't. And we have to have a different vision of how we build with health and justice in mind. And once we accept the challenge of doing that world building work, suddenly we see a future in which all these things, health, the planet, all are getting better at once. And so happy to report, this is our home here. We just got all the gas out of our house. So we got the stove and the panels and heat pumps. And you can see on the bottom left there, we just got our meter removed. So we're really excited about that. But of course, I have the privilege of doing that because I have the resources and was able to commit money to it. And that's not the answer. We got to have policy. So I'm from the Bay Area, and I won't go through all of these, but you all are seeing the important state-based bills that are being passed across the country, important ones being passed here now, and now we've got to execute. But ultimately, I'm in the midst of all the challenges here. Great sources of hope and courage come from an extraordinary movement that's happening around the world. I think when I started this work in 2018, I never could have thought we'd be able to make as much progress as we have in the last 5 years. Every piece of progress for me makes me realize how far we still have to go. But it also makes me realize how much we are able to do and how much the solutions are at hand. There was a major study in Nature last year that showed if we keep going, if we execute some of these Paris Agreement commitments, we might be able to hold below 2 degrees Celsius, which we all know is not good enough. But I feel determined and committed to be able to create this world for our children and mitigate the impacts of climate change the best we can. This is the most updated RODIUM graph showing US emissions. You can see we bumped up again in 2022, but I look at this graph, we think about all the mistakes we've made over the course of multiple decades. They see our target here at the end, where we need to get to abide by our Paris Agreement, 50% reduction by 2030. And I'm just determined to get there, and grateful to work with you all to do this shared work. Okay, that's all I've got. I will pass it back to our moderators and happy to take any questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Basu, for that interesting and informative presentation. So if anyone has a question, please click on the hands up in the reactions section down at the bottom. You'll find a little icon where you can just raise your hand that way. And I'm looking at the participants list and waiting for somebody to, there we go. Ed Wall has a question.
Hi,
Ed, 30 seconds, make it quick. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, very much. That was very, very informative. My question is, one of the headlines in the in your headings was fossil gas, but right now the utilities are pursuing what they call renewable natural gas, but it's still over 90% methane, and it's the methane is the culprit. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there's these linguistic kind of gymnastics that people are doing, and there was just another study, right? I think last week showing that clean energy is cheaper, and you know, we've made a commitment to end greenhouse gas emissions. We've made that commitment at the state level, and we now have statutory requirements to report out on it and do it. So let's stop digging the hole and get serious about this and build the clean stuff that is available. I'm not saying it's easy. I don't want to simplify this. We've got to make our grid more resilient and grow it, and transmission lines. I get there's a lot of moving pieces here, but for me, we've got the solutions at hand and we just got to build it. So I don't really have too much patience with playing around with anything else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Arthur McEwen.
Yes, thanks very much. You mentioned that there were something like 21 other pollutants and in the house other than the methane from natural gas. What are the sources of
Well,
those?
it's all coming from the methane. You know, I think like formaldehyde, I probably could remember some. Formaldehyde's one of them as well. But they just put sensors out for, you know, I mean, and the thing to like appreciate is that, you know, the pipelines are coming directly into our homes, right? So, you know, it's dirty stuff that has a variety of different toxins. I remember benzene and formaldehyde being two of the most dramatic ones, but I could easily share the link to the study here in a second and list out the other ones.
In other words, they come in with the natural gas.
Yeah.
Okay. Maureen Whitley.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank-
Basu. Obviously, you said indoor air pollution is important and we need to get gas out of the house. But what would you say to Cambridge parents whose children, you know, have chronic diseases like asthma, who can't immediately get rid of their gas stove? What advice would you have for them?
Yeah, no, and that's an important part. And thanks. I wasn't able to kind of go over everything. And I think that's a really important piece. So if we just say, hey, you know, this is a real danger, you're right, that there's a lot of people, I don't want to stoke concern among parents saying, well, what do I do? And there's actually a lot you can do. So ventilation is critical. And so when we talk about vents, it's not the kind, there's these vents that just vent back into the room, that doesn't do anything. You got to vent out of the house. And, you know, you got to open door, you know, some people don't have the hoods also, right? That's an issue, but opening a window is really critical. You know, there's even pieces like the pollutants are most impactful in the kitchen area. So even being a little bit in a different room makes a big difference. So I think those are considerations. If you have family members with chronic illness, particularly respiratory disease, I think it's important to be thinking, I'm turning this on right now and pollutants are popping out. Let me ventilate and let's keep folks away. I think are like major interventions that will improve the exposure risk.
Maureen Whitley.
Thank you. Where do you find a geothermal contractor in the great state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts?
That I don't know, my friend. We'll have to ask someone else. We got to find heat, or maybe one of the mothers out front folks will know. But you know, we're doing pilots here. Patty, I don't know if you know anything about that, but you know, geothermal is you know, a serious consideration for renewable energies.
Seth might have some ideas. If you do, Seth, would you put it in the chat? If anybody knows, please put it in the chat. Elena.
Thank you, Dr. Basu, for this presentation. I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about the impact of climate change and especially heat on children. I know that their bodies heat up faster than adults' bodies, and the consequences can be more dramatic. And if you could also discuss another important health equity impact, which is like the impact on workers who do their work outside.
Yeah.
Like construction workers, delivery workers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for children, you know, I'm not a pediatrician, so I don't want to. I don't have as much expertise on the, you know, like the pathophysiology of it. But one thing I think I want to highlight is that I think we really need to think about the impacts on mental health for children during heat waves. I mean, there's a lot of studies showing learning decreases. You know, there's all these issues of schools having to close because of heat waves. And you know, most of the patients I take care of, I'm thinking about people with you know, cardiovascular disease and COPD and things like that. So thankfully, most children don't have many of those underlying comorbidities. But you know, issues of dehydration and good perfusion to their kidneys and the rest of their organs is critical in all of this. But one of the main things I think about is impact on mental health and learning for children. For workers, I totally hear that, you know, the Biden administration, I think, has done a pretty good, well, they brought it to the forefront, and they have, you know, they have made new rules and regulations about occupational risks related to heat. They I think, did a pretty impressive report on that and created regulations. But, you know, I talked about my patient who was in Central America when much of his heat exposure occurred, but it made me think about my patients here as well, construction workers, folks who are working in factories. There's been a lot of studies about incarcerated individuals, right, who are in jails, and there are not good cooling systems there. So, you know, the issue with so much of this is that the invisibility of it, right? There's an insidious nature to this challenge, and if we're not actively looking and making it visible, a great deal of harm can happen unless we're proactively making policy and occupational protections.
So we still have a couple of minutes left. If anyone else has a question for Dr. Basu.
I wanted to ask what actions you or maybe anybody else at the meeting suggest the average person could take. Not about you know, climate and health in general, but steps going forward, maybe to improve legislation. I don't know, things we can do to encourage others to help these important initiatives.
Well, I think you're doing it right now. You know, I think for me, it's building community, right? It's educating ourselves. And I think it feels really important to me. You know, I talk to doctors about this a lot, where I think to get into this work feels like it's daunting, or it's like, how will I ever understand climate science, or, you know, how am I going to really know how to make an impact? Climate is an everything issue, right? So it impacts all the things we love. So, you know, my message is to think about the things you love, think the people you love, think about your local communities, the institutions and organizations that you're close a part of, and think about that. You know, my kids are just starting in elementary schools here in Cambridge. And so now I'll tell you, you know, when I'm dropping my kids off and I see the buses, you know, running their engines while they're idling, I'm like pulling the principal and saying, hey, how come they're doing that? Because actually, I think there's a law, right? They're not supposed to do that. I just want to emphasize that getting one step forward allows that next step, you know, and I think there's no step that's too small. I think it starts with talking about it. The Catherine Hayhoe is this famous climate scientist, MacArthur Genius Award winner, and her TED Talk is about just talking about it. And I think now I'm quite sure that it's not that people don't think about climate change. I think they just feel overwhelmed about it. And I slip it into meetings I have and random other topics, and I try to bring it up. And a few people have like done things about it after that. So I think building community, educating yourself, finding something small to intervene on are critical pieces. And you've got a great group here to help you find other pathways forward.
Fabulous. We have time for one more question, and I see that Elise Plain has a question.
Hi, thank you, and thanks for the presentation. It was really inspiring and very useful. It might not be your area of expertise, but you mentioned that there was no indoor air regulation with the EPA. Do you know whether there's any plan of doing this at the federal level today in this coming administration?
Yeah, well, if the conversation about the Consumer Protection Agency regulating stoves said anything, I think it's going to be hard to get 60 votes in the Congress, and U.S. House is another issue. So I don't think that. So what I used to think, how come the EPA is not having firmer regulations on indoor air pollution? Like, how come they're just not making regulations? The Clean Air Act does specifically say outdoor air pollution, so they don't have legal authority to do it indoor now. Now, like literally, we're talking about the same pollutants. And I think, indoor, for me at least, I did not think enough about indoor air pollution. But then again, we are exposed to those more. We spend more time indoors. And, obviously it's not able to spread around. So I don't think that at the federal level, there's much hope we can pass anything. Now, Clean Air Act, I think, was passed by Nixon, right? So it shows, this doesn't have to be a political issue, but unfortunately right now, I don't think there's prospects for that. But that's at the federal level. We could be thinking about a different state or municipal level as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Basu. And everyone, you will have more opportunity. We're going to hear from Seth, and then you will have opportunity to ask him questions. And at the end, you'll be able to ask both of our presenters questions. So now let me introduce Seth Federspiel. So Seth Federspiel is the Climate Program Manager for the City of Cambridge Community Development Department, where he leads a 6-member team advancing greenhouse gas reductions and climate resilience outreach and policy development and implementation. He is responsible for carrying out the 25-year net zero action plan to phase out greenhouse gas emissions across Cambridge. Key initiatives include enabling energy efficiency in existing buildings, developing net zero building standards for new developments, and achieving decarbonization of the energy supply. Seth formerly worked on climate strategies for the Massachusetts EPA and in policy and analysis for the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Seth holds a master's degree in environmental policy from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. Please welcome Seth Federspiel to our community forum. Take it away, Seth.
Great. Thanks so much, Christine. And thanks everyone for taking the time to participate this evening and for inviting me to take part in this conversation. So let me pull up my slides. All right, can folks see the full screen slides here? Great. So again, my name is Seth Federspiel. I'm the Climate Program Manager for the City of Cambridge, and I'm going to give a very brief overview of the current status of the amendment conversation around the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance that Christine introduced at the beginning of the conversation. And I want to emphasize up front that this conversation is still very much in progress, and so all of the different concepts and policy elements of the amendments are still up for discussion and input from all of you. And ultimately, it'll be up to the City Council to decide how to put together a proposal that can move forward. So I'm just going to give a brief background about where we're coming from and the overview of the amendment process to date. Then I'll go through the key components of the amendments that are being discussed, so folks can understand what those look like. Talk a little bit about what complying with these amendments might look like for buildings, depending on the final form of the requirements, and then finish up with resources at the city, state, and federal level to support BEUDO buildings in achieving these types of greenhouse emission reductions. So as Christine mentioned in the introduction, BEUDO is part of the City of Cambridge Net Zero Action Plan, which is our citywide plan for reducing emissions from buildings in Cambridge. And Gaurav had shown a slide showing the breakdown of emissions at the national level. In Cambridge, it's pretty different. Since we're such a dense community, most of our emissions come from buildings. So in the latest inventory, it's 83% of our emissions come from buildings. And so the Net Zero Action Plan, again, is our focus plan on how we can address those emissions over time. And this slide shows what the structure of that plan looks like. So it has actions to take on emissions from existing buildings, from new buildings, and from the energy supply system. And it does that through a combination of requirements, like the potential BEUDO amendments, incentives and support, like the programs that I'll talk about at the end of the presentation, as well as enabling actions. And so, again, I'm focusing on BEUDO tonight over here, but in order for the Net Zero Action Plan to be successful, all of the actions need to come together. So requirements and support programs for smaller buildings, for new buildings, as well as for that renewable energy supply system. The history of the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, it was adopted in 2014 as a reporting requirement. So the goal was to understand better where energy use was coming from in buildings, so that both the city and the building owners could think about how to address that energy use over time. And BEUDO applies to different buildings of different sizes. So municipal buildings on parcels with 10,000 square feet or more of buildings, residential buildings on parcels with 50 or more units, and then non-residential buildings with 25,000 or more square feet. And that was phased down. It was 50,000 in 2015 and then phased down to 25,000 in 2016. And in that original ordinance, language was written in requiring the city to, in 2018, review the effect of BEUDO and decide whether additional performance requirements were merited to achieve significant reductions in energy use. So we did that review, found that the energy use has been fairly level over time. And so that then initiated the process of working towards the amendments that are being discussed today. So again, that process began in 2017, actually, with background policy research and analysis. And then in 2018, 2019, and 2020, really going through a process of working with a number of the affected BEUDO property owners and other folks to understand, what ideas for BEUDO amendment proposals could look like. In hindsight, we could have done an even better job of engaging the whole community in that input process. And so we're really happy to have even a broader set of input and representation throughout the community today. But based on that process, the city did submit a proposed amendment language to City Council at the end of 2021. And then since then, it's been in City Council's hands to really discuss and review and consider responses to that policy. And so the key change to the original proposal that's been discussed in Council and was voted on in the committee was to change the net zero deadline for BEUDO buildings from 2050 up to 2035. And so then along with that, there's been a lot of discussion about would there be other flexibility mechanisms to make achieving those goals more feasible for BEUDO buildings. Excuse me. So I'm just going to, again, really briefly run through what was in the original BEUDO amendment proposal, and then give a status update for the key elements that are under discussion today. So the proposal was based on a relative performance standard where each building would set its own baseline based on the average emissions in 2018 and 2019, and then would have predictable targeted emission reductions over time from that baseline. And so the proposal was that each building would have to reduce by about 20% of its baseline emissions every 5 years to reach that net zero by 2050 target. To do that, buildings could pick from on-site reductions such as energy efficiency, on-site renewables, or decarbonization, electrifying fossil fuels, off-site pathways such as purchasing off-site renewable electricity either directly or through the city's aggregation program, or the ability to purchase alternative compliance credits. We had specific pathways for affordable housings, labs, and campuses to acknowledge some of the unique challenges of those building types, as well as exemptions for buildings that were already achieving net zero emissions or were under financial distress. And there was a suggestion that the policy be reviewed periodically and adjusted to take account for changes in technological and policy context. So again, these are the key points of the original 2021 proposal. And next I'm going to go through of these key points where the discussion is around some of the main questions. So again, the central question mark that's been being discussed is how fast should buildings get to net zero emissions? So to walk you through this chart, the dotted blue line is that original proposal. So buildings, this shows the percentage of baseline emissions. So in 2025, buildings would have had to reduce their emissions by 20%. Then in 2030, another 20%, and so on in steps downward to achieving net zero in 2050. The council proposal that was voted on in committee last year was to accelerate that deadline to 2035 and to have that trajectory be a linear pathway from the 20% reduction in 2025 to zero in 2035. So that works out to about an 8% reduction per year. The other pathway that's been discussed since then is a potential carve out for residential buildings to give them more time to plan and achieve their emission reductions. And so that one potential pathway that's being discussed is that residential buildings would have until 2030 to begin making emission reductions, then would have to achieve an initial 50% reduction in emissions in 2030. And then every 5 years thereafter, another 12.5% reduction in steps down to zero in 2050. So again, this is kind of one of the key questions now is what is the target for achieving net zero among BEUDO buildings, and which buildings are on which BEUDO buildings are on which target trajectory. As I mentioned before, then there's also been question about if there are accelerated targets, what other flexibility mechanisms would be needed for buildings to help achieve those targets. The original proposal language is in black, and then the new concepts are in red. So again, the original proposal had a concept that buildings could choose to purchase alternative compliance credits from the city that would then be reinvested into greenhouse gas emission reduction projects throughout the city. And that was proposed to be set at $234, which was based on a study in Boston of the average cost across BEUDO building types of reducing emissions over time. So in addition to that flexibility mechanism, there's also been discussion about buildings being able to essentially trade emission reductions. So if one building is having a hard time reducing their emissions, but another can exceed the target in a given year, the first building could purchase those extra emission reductions from the other building. The other concept here is the potential for buildings to defer their emission reductions and essentially bank what they need to achieve for a number of years, but then at the end of the time period have to make up additional emission reductions so that the cumulative reductions are the same over time. The next big topic that's been introduced is the idea of carbon credits or offsets. So carbon offsets are the concept of paying for emission reductions in another location that then are taken credit for within the building. And so a number of questions around carbon credits or offsets are whether those offsets would be required to come from local sources in and around Cambridge, or if they'd be allowed to come from sources in other parts of the country or even other parts of the world. Along with that, the question of the amount of carbon credits that could be used and over what timeline. And so the question of whether global credits would be allowed on a different timeline than local credits. The process for certifying carbon credits and what criteria would go into that certification. And then the cost of those credits and whether those credits should have what's been discussed as price parity or the same cost as the alternative compliance credits to incentivize buildings to take action on site before pursuing these off-site actions. So again, all of these elements are up for discussion now. Another part of the original proposal was setting criteria for off-site renewable electricity to encourage buildings to purchase renewable electricity both through the grid and then above and beyond what's available from the grid, but to make sure that that new renewable electricity comes from sources that are really adding to what's on the grid now, as opposed to just kind of shuffling it around. And so these criteria here would establish those requirements. And the intent is that the Cambridge Community Electricity Aggregation Program is moving towards sources of renewable energy that would satisfy these requirements so that buildings could satisfy their offsite renewable energy needs by electing to participate in the city's aggregation program. And then finally, there's been discussion about a number of additional exemptions. I mentioned the financial distress exemption, part of the original proposal, but a number of additional exemption ideas to try to kind of mitigate concerns that have come up along the discussion process. So a question of what happens if Eversource can't deliver enough electricity? Should there be an exemption for buildings there? How should backup generation be treated if the building is using fossil fuels for backup? Would that be counted toward their BEUDO emissions or not? For buildings that have multiple owners, so condos, either in residential or commercial settings, would each owner's emissions be counted separately or together? Again, how to count that community choice aggregation electricity. What support is expected from the department, and then what happens if a building can't get equipment that they need, or the supply chain does not live up to an expected pace of action. So a lot up for discussion, and again, I'm happy to answer more questions about these in the Q&A, with the caveat that I probably don't have the answers because none of this has been finally settled. But just moving towards wrapping up, I wanted to talk a little bit about what compliance might look like for buildings, depending on how the final ordinance ends up. So starting with a multifamily building, this is a compliance scenario for an average building. As we've heard very clearly, there is no one average building. So each building is going to be different. And each building is going to have its own pathway towards reducing emissions. And part of the goal of the policy design is not to prescribe certain actions, but to let the building choose which one is the best fit for that building. But just to give a hypothetical, if an average building starts out with a little under 500 tons of emissions, a residential building with 170 tons of emissions from electricity and about 300 from gas. If we assume that through a combination of the state grid getting cleaner and the aggregation program offering renewables, that the building could access 100% renewable electricity in 2030, it would achieve a 36% reduction just from acquiring that clean electricity. So to achieve the 50% proposed reduction, the building would have to pursue additional efficiency or electrification measures to reduce 22% of that original gas use. Turning over to an office and lab building. That building has a more even split of electricity and gas, if anything, with a higher emphasis towards electricity. The proposed target for 2030 for these buildings is a 60% reduction, of which about 55% could come from 100% renewable electricity in 2030. So that hypothetical building would have to take an additional 11% off of the gas use through efficiency or electrification to hit that 60% target. And then an office building, a hypothetical office building, is much more heavily skewed towards the electricity side. So that building, thanks to the high amount of renewable electricity, could actually achieve a 66% reduction in 2030. And that would satisfy the full 60% reduction required in 2030. So that building would have more time to then phase out the gas use by the 2035 net zero target. And so just wrapping up, I did want to emphasize the resources that the city and state and federal government already have in place and are developing further to support BEUDO buildings in emission reductions. So in Cambridge, we've been running a program called the Multifamily Retrofit Advisor. This is a technical support program where multifamily buildings can call up and get expert support from a vendor to figure out where there are opportunities to reduce emissions in their buildings, understand the state incentive programs, and then make a plan for how to phase out emissions over time in a way that works for that building. We've also been working together with Eversource through the Cambridge Building Energy Retrofit Program to, in particular, help commercial buildings understand, again, kind of where the state incentives align with the goals of the building, and to put the building in touch with the Eversource energy efficiency account executives who can help come up with custom incentive packages for those buildings. We're excited that in the next few weeks, we're going to be launching a new pilot program with the company Block Power. Block Power is a technology company out of New York that helps to analyze opportunities for greenhouse gas emission reductions in buildings, and then offers financing so that buildings can pursue greenhouse gas emission reductions with no upfront costs. And depending on the finance of the project, it may end up being a cost neutral project over time compared to the existing utility bills. So that does vary from building to building. And then again, we're evolving the multifamily program to focus on that planning for decarbonization over time, and continuing to work on the renewable electricity through the Cambridge Electricity Program. And then last slide here, just want to highlight a few of the state incentives through Mass Save. Mass Save is really evolving quickly to be focused more on decarbonization and has significant incentives both for energy efficiency and electrification. And then we're really excited to continue to learn more about the federal incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, and think about how we can best bring those resources to Cambridge buildings and layer them on with the state incentives as well. I'm going to wrap up there and happy to take clarifying questions now and be part of the conversation later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth. That was really interesting, and how exciting to know that so much can be achieved by choosing 100% clean electricity right away. That was really informative. Thank you. All right, so there were a lot of really great questions in the chat, and now is the time to ask them. And I see our first person here is Kathy Dalton. And you're muted.
Sorry about that. Hi, Christine. Hi, Seth. I see a lot of familiar faces. I wish we could get anywhere like 50% by changing to clean electricity in our building. Seth, the Natural Resources Defense Council says there's no retrofit available for those of us in larger multifamily buildings that heat our entire buildings with steam to convert them to heat pumps, and that the technology for hot water systems, those of us who heat with hot water, isn't yet stable or mature. This is a two-parter. Are you aware of something the Natural Resources Defense Council was not aware of? For those of us who, we are only 1 to 3% of the building's emissions, according to your department. Why won't you start with the single family, 1 to 4 family homes where the technology for heat pump conversion for small residential is much more mature and stable now? Instead of with those of us for whom we don't have access to stable technology or a workforce that understands the engineering needs of our older, larger, complex buildings. And this is my apartment I'm talking about.
Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate the question. So we did an electrification pathways study a couple of years ago where we worked with a consultant to look at all the different building types in Cambridge, and with them to come up with technical pathways for achieving decarbonization over time. So that did include large multifamily buildings with central systems. It's obviously complicated and varies from building to building, but there are technologies that exist now, and we expect those technologies to evolve over time. In terms of the, in terms of why multifamily buildings are being included in this policy now and single family buildings are not, the goal here is to encompass all of the buildings that are currently subject to the BEUDO ordinance as it stands now, and I went through the thresholds earlier, but to then follow up with regulations for smaller buildings as well. So the Net Zero Action Plan is committed to tackling all of the buildings in Cambridge that are emissions, and so the goal for smaller buildings is to work towards implementing transaction point requirements. So when buildings are sold or renovated or potentially rented, to have that be a trigger point at which point energy and emission upgrades would be required.
We would like the same consideration, and we've been hiring people and talking to people, and we do not think this is correct. We think the NRDC is correct and not the statement you've just made.
Thank you.
All right, so just to remind everybody, we've got 10 minutes with Seth, and then we're going to have 20 minutes with both our presenters at the end. Rachel Lyon.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much, Seth, for your excellent presentation. And of course, I am completely with everything that you're saying. But some of the pushback that I've heard is, well, how is Eversource in Cambridge and National Grid and other places going to actually produce 100% renewable electricity? And does this mean upgrading the grid? And, you know, all kinds of questions. And I've read things in other cities that's one of the big things that's stopping us from electrifying, is that the grid needs to be upgraded. So I'm just wondering what kind of information you have on that.
Thanks for the question, Rachel. So there's actually two parts of that. So one is producing the renewable electricity, and then the second part is delivering the renewable electricity. So Eversource does not produce any electricity in Massachusetts electricity regulations. They're not allowed to own electricity generation. So they just deliver it. The production is coming from other companies. And so the city right now is pursuing contracts with new renewable energy power plants, so wind farms and solar plants in other parts of the country. And then we would take credit for the renewable energy generated by those power plants through owning the RECs, the renewable energy attributes. And then at the state level, the state climate bills require progressively larger amounts of renewables in Massachusetts, and that's where we're seeing a lot of the offshore wind development and other technologies. So that'll over time address the amount of renewables being delivered to the grid. Now, in terms of getting the electricity to buildings in Cambridge, that is, will be a challenge over time as more and more buildings demand electricity. But we currently have quite a bit of time where under the current grid, the most electricity right now is demanded in the summer. And so that gives us time for buildings to gradually electrify and use more electricity in the winter. And that gives Eversource time to plan and work on upgrading the grid over time. So that will take, eventually more investment in the grid. but it's not an all at once thing. And so there is time to phase in those grid investments over time. And then a big piece of it is also focusing on the energy efficiency. And so there's some talk, there's a question and then some talk in the chat about technologies like geothermal energy or ground source heat pumps that can provide heating and cooling to buildings with a much smaller amounts of energy demanded, of electricity demanded. And so that can help us take advantage of the grid infrastructure that we have without requiring upgrading it as quickly as we would if we use less efficient technologies.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Frank Spicer.
Yes, thank you. You started with in 2014 with your first requirement, and then in 2018 you introduced amendments. It is now 2022, and those amendments are now being discussed. What's the timeline that you see for coming to some regulatory objective? Because in fact, 7 years is not a long time to get to 2030.
For sure.
And nothing's going to happen before regulations are in place.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that question, Frank. I unfortunately I don't have the answer for sure. If I could predict that, then that would be great. You know, again, what we're working on now is really trying to bring as many folks into the process and building as much consensus as possible, so that we can, you know, in discussion with City Council, have a proposal that is, you know, workable for all aspects of the community. So, you know, that's an ongoing conversation, but ultimately it's up to City Council for when they move forward with a concrete proposal and take a vote on whether to adopt it.
Okay.
But certainly we certainly are conscious of the lead time that it takes for buildings to plan for these changes.
Jen Swartz.
Hi, I have two questions, but I'll make them quick. The first is, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned it, is what happens if and when a building doesn't lower its emissions? Like, what are the consequences? And the second is, I kind of just wanted to point out there's a recent study or article about an investigation about most carbon offsets being greenwashing and not actually offsetting the amount that they claim to be offsetting. So I liked your idea of, you know, keeping it somewhat local. So we had a way of monitoring it, maybe in the state of Massachusetts, but I can't imagine where there's anywhere enough space in Cambridge to offset the kind of carbon you would need for these buildings. So if you were allowing carbon offsetting as an option, I think each location you allow it comes with risks. I would be careful allowing people to spend their money on something that might not actually lower their emissions, or restricting them on offsetting in an area where there's not enough offsetting available.
Okay, let's let Seth answer that question, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So on the offset question, we've been, as part of the Net Zero Action Plan, we've been studying what a quote unquote local carbon fund could look like to try to understand the supply of offsets in Cambridge, you know, Cambridge city boundaries, in the region, in New England, and to be able to make recommendations about what local would appropriately be, and also to understand what the processes and logistics would be for actually verifying those emissions and emission reductions and being able to accurately attribute them to individual buildings. So that's still in the works, but the goal is that that would be able to then support a program if that were to be allowed under the BEUDO amendments. And to answer your first question, so the amendments that were proposed to council in 2021 do have fines for buildings that do not comply with the requirements. So either by not reporting their emissions to begin with, by reporting false information, or by not achieving the required emission reductions. The city is somewhat limited in terms of how we can structure those fines. So the proposal was that it would be up to a $300 per day fine for each violation. But that's obviously the kind of last resort measure, and the goal is that we would work with buildings to help them figure out pathways to actually reducing their emissions either on site or through the off-site options.
Diane Martin.
Thank you.
Oh, hi, Seth. I know that you told Frank that you can't predict how much longer it will be before this is enacted, but maybe you can at least comment on why this process was started in 2017. It's 2023 now. We're 2 to 3 years away from any enactment of these. Why is it taking so long? Firstly, and secondly, what is the city going to do in order to hold people accountable? And I don't mean what kind of fine. I mean, what kind of staff is in place to actually check whether or not buildings are in compliance? Thanks.
Sure, thanks, Diane. So, I mean, I think it's taken a long time for a number of reasons. It is a very complicated concept, and so one that we're really trying to get all the pieces right on. The pandemic definitely slowed things down, so we had kind of an initial proposal ready in 2019, and then when the pandemic hit, that really delayed the internal legal review process to get that proposal to City Council. So that's why there was the initial gap from 2020 to the end of 2021 proposal. And then since it's been with council, there's been a lot of legitimate questions and concerns about what is in the ordinance, who is involved in coming up with the ideas, and that's really the robust discussion that we're having now. In terms of administrative capacity, we do have on my team a full-time staffer who's responsible for overseeing compliance with BEUDO. And so she's working on both compliance with the current ordinance, as well as gearing up for compliance with eventual performance requirements. And as we think ahead to future year budgets, are thinking about additional capacity needs that would be appropriate.
All right, and I just want to remind everyone that we there's still more questions for Seth, but if you have any questions for Dr. Basu, you can step in now also. Marley. You'll just unmute yourself. Marley, you there?
Oh, sorry.
That's all
right. Eversource said it needed 4 substations and 2,000 transformers in order to have the capacity for Cambridge toward its goal of 2050. And on a more granular implementation and feasibility, there are a lot of historical buildings over 100 years old who have steam and radiator systems, and the technology hasn't been available yet, according to a number of studies. And how do you plan to help retrofit these older buildings without technology to 100% electrical, when in order to retrofit those systems, the walls would have to be opened and torn out and to replace with upgraded systems? And where do those tenants go? They get displaced because it's against code not to have heat or hot water in those older historical buildings.
Okay.
Thanks, Marilee. Those are great questions. And to kind of link them together, I think that's where it's important to keep in mind the timeline of the proposed policy. As I said before, it's not an all at once thing. So it's not that every building in Cambridge is going to flip over to electricity overnight. And similarly, for an individual building, it's not going to be an overnight change. And so for the building pathways, again, that's where we're offering technical advising services to help buildings really plan an approach that makes sense for that building over time. And for Eversource, there's a lot of assumptions behind those numbers and kind of worst case scenarios. And, like I said, it'll be a gradual process for buildings to electrify over time. And there are opportunities there to use more efficient technologies that can reduce the demand. and for Eversource to gradually build up that infrastructure capacity as they need it. So that's really the goal here is to lay out a predictable pathway so that all of the stakeholders involved, the buildings, the utilities, and others can plan and anticipate the needed changes that will occur over a long period of time.
And who pays for that? You have elderly and fixed income, so that's a problem.
Seth,
I'm finished.
Sure, I can address that. I mean, so again, it's upgrades that occur over time. And this is where we're excited to really leverage the state incentives and the federal incentives that exist now and that we, again, expect to strengthen over time. I'd remind folks that, it's in state law that Massachusetts as a whole has to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And so we're really excited to work in partnership with the state as they continue to develop state level policies and programs and supports to help buildings achieve this level of decarbonization over that very long time period.
okay, great, thank you. Elise?
Yes, hello, thanks a lot for your very interesting presentation. To make the link with the first speaker's presentation, I was wondering what impacts could global offsets have on local health? Has it been measured?
I don't know of any of those studies. I mean, I think there's been a conversation here about the complexity and offsets, what really lie under that. But the issue, I think we don't talk enough about air pollution and when you are burning things, the combustion of fossil fuels causes immediate impact from pollutants. So it was showing that 1 out of 5 premature deaths a year we can attribute to the exposure to air pollution. So I haven't seen a study like that, and I don't really there's investing in tree canopies and other ways that we are supporting ecology is important, but I don't think in the framework of offsets.
Okay, Elise?
Yes, thanks for giving me the speech again. Dr. Basu, I was wondering when you were, if I may say, climatizing the curricula at Harvard Medical School, what were the major roadblocks that you had to go over? And on the contrary, what were the unsuspected open doors that you got in achieving this revolution in the mindsets?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I've been so encouraged by that project, and it has been surprising how receptive and great everyone has been, and so the biggest thing to navigate is that there's a lot to learn in med school. I mean, that's very real. There's a lot of material, and so the challenge for our team was to say we can't just add a climate course, right? That wouldn't work in medical school. And so we're trying to design this way, my background's in kind of educational pedagogies of how we can integrate it into the existing curriculum. So that's our approach, is to go to every course and say, all right, infectious diseases are the focus here, air pollution is the focus there, impacts of heat or organ systems. We have social medicine courses. And so we actually really do, relationship building with course directors and say, hey, we want you to achieve your course objectives even better because of these inserts we are doing. But we're going to have, every course director has accepted and in many times asked for more content than we suggested. And we'll have, for our focus this past year has been the first year medical students. There'll be climate content in every first year medical student course for the pathway students. So the inspiring stuff is the medical students. We've got a faculty group and a medical student group. And so, what's nice on the faculty side is we've got kind of content experts across the various hospitals. So if we're talking about a certain organ system, we know who we can go to. And, for me, it's a practice. I think, it's parallel to the health equity work, where it's a practice of understanding how broader social factors impacts the health of our patients, and creating a practice of understanding how we need to be calibrating our diagnostic skills, our counseling to patients based on a warming planet. I had a patient there, WBR ran a piece on a patient of mine who got West Nile encephalitis a few years ago. We're not sure, but we are wondering and concerned that as Massachusetts gets warmer, if mosquito-borne illnesses, the incidence will increase here. And so that means, as we're teaching our students, they need to be, that we call it a differential diagnosis, the list of things a thing could be. When someone comes in and you're not sure what the diagnosis is, you do testing based on what your differential diagnosis is. And we need to broaden that and be nimble to understanding. And there's a lot we don't know yet about how it will play out here locally. So anyway, it's been a really enjoyable project so far.
Thank you.
Christine, I think you're on mute.
Did you call on me, Christine?
I did, Sharon.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you. This is a question for Dr. Basu. We have a real problem with heat islands in Cambridge, and I'm wondering, do emissions reductions mitigate the heat island effect?
Do emissions reductions mitigate the heat island effect? Well, yeah, future heat island effects. So, again, emissions are heat trapping gases that cause infrared rays not to bounce out of our atmosphere and cause solar rays to get stuck. And so the more gases we put out, the more gas trapping phenomenon there'll be, which will make everything warmer, right? And so the heat island phenomenon is that you've got concrete and asphalt, and this is why places like, Chelsea and East Boston are dramatic. I think many folks have seen this, that it can be 85 degrees here in Cambridge and 110 in Chelsea. I mean, that's dramatic, because the canopies are, there's just a great study that just came out earlier this week about the impacts of, I'm going to forget the exact number, but they modeled out, a decrease in mortality on communities that had great tree canopies in Europe. And I think it was something, I don't want to say the number, I think it was something in the 30% area of mortality reduction. So, mitigating climate change stops the phenomenon of us trapping these infrared and solar rays in our atmosphere. But trees are also an adaptation strategy, right? Is that, as we know, we will continue to warm in the coming decades. The city actually did a great job on my street. Quentin helped me a little bit. We said we didn't have enough trees, and we reached out to the city, and they came and they planted 10 trees. And the hope is over time they'll make a real canopy so that elderly neighbors will have a different experience on a very hot day when they're walking on the street.
Thank you very much.
Ed Wall.
Thank you, Christine. And also, this is a question for Seth. A couple of questions. The first is, on a hot water system, you can actually have an electric boiler, which is very common in Europe. And what are the barriers to doing that here in Cambridge? And related to that is the fact that Eversource Gas has a parent that also owns Eversource Electric. And the longer Eversource Gas continues pumping gas through the pipelines, it's better for the parent. That owns both those. But if you have electric boilers, then that's the advantage of the electric subsidiary of Eversource's parent. So those are sort of two related questions, but why can't we have electric boilers for hot water systems?
Yeah, so electric resistance boilers are readily available as technology for hot water boilers, really at any scale. So from the small individual residential building to a large multifamily building. The problem with electric resistance is that it's not very efficient. So it's a 1-to-1 efficiency level, whereas an electric heat pump system, like a heat pump, works similarly to a heat pump for cooling and heating your house, like Gaurav showed he get upgraded to in his presentation. And there are heat pump water heaters. They work well in the smaller setting. That technology is still developing in terms of the larger multifamily setting. And so while it is an option and is becoming more common, and this gets at the efficiency question and how much electricity capacity we'll need. So it's balancing the pace at which we get off of fossil fuels with the efficiency of the electrical alternatives.
Thank you very much.
To Stafford.
Yeah, this is for Seth. You may already have answered this and I didn't quite get it, but am I understanding this right that I can't put solar panels on my roof? It's not located properly. Could I buy into a solar farm somewhere, anywhere, and meet the requirements of this ordinance, or what would be the ordinance? And a second piece, and the same would be true of geothermal, I assume that would count. What about energy efficiency? Does that have any role to play here, or is that so tiny that it doesn't even register?
Yeah, so I'll take those questions in reverse. Energy efficiency is really important. Energy efficiency is reducing the amount of energy you need to run your building, right? So you want to insulate your building so that you need less energy to heat it in the winter and to cool it in the summer. You want efficient lighting and other electricity so that you're using less electricity. So that's really the starting point for any building. It tends to be the most cost-effective. Most energy efficiency projects pay for themselves in a very short period of time. Geothermal is an energy efficiency technology. Geothermal, it's not, or ground source heat pumps, they're not actually creating energy. They're transferring the energy from the ground into your building to help cool or heat it. And like I mentioned earlier, that's a very efficient way to do it without fossil fuels. It's more efficient than an air source heat pump because it utilizes the constant temperature of the ground. So tomorrow when it's -5 out, a ground source heat pump works at the same level of efficiency as when it's 30 degrees out, whereas an air source heat pump loses efficiency. And then in terms of the renewables, so I very briefly touched on the criteria. There will be criteria that say we want the renewable electricity to come from new renewable energy sources, so that it's adding to what's out there. And what the city is doing to facilitate that is adding that type of new renewable electricity to our community electricity aggregation program, which anyone in the city can opt into, and thereby check off that renewable electricity criteria.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're just about at time. I think I don't see any hands up, and I'd like to thank both of our presenters. It was very interesting. I hope the rest of you learned something tonight. We plan to follow up with emails to everybody. We will put interesting things, links, important links, because a lot of people put some links in. And so, but
Can I ask if the chat is going to be saved?
Yes.
It will be saved and available.
Yeah, we're going to
You can save it yourself by pressing the 3 dots.
Okay.
Under more?
Yeah, it's at the bottom. Everyone can save the chat. Where you see format, screenshot, file, the little smiley face, and then 3 dots.
Oh, great.
Save chat.
Wonderful.
Sorry, Christine.
No, thank you. That was super helpful. And I'm sorry, there's a lot going on in the chat. And so I'm missing something. We've got, like, if anybody wants to, we've got the room for a little while longer. If anybody wants to hang out, I see that Patty wants to say something.
I just want to say thank you and also let people know I do appreciate all the conversation here, and also both Representative Rogers, State Senator Will Brownsberger, Steve Owens. I mean, we are talking about Cambridge now, but there's also some enabling legislation and funding and support at the state level that's going to really help us do this. And all of those people on this call have been working really hard on this and have filed a number of bills and will continue to work on it. So kudos to them and thank you. And all of you who they represent, make sure you reach out to them and make sure the state is going to be in a much better position to bring together the technical support and the funding to do this. And also, this is not set in stone. There's been some back and forth with many of us on chat. We are working through it and we all want to make this work. And we understand that there's some issues, particularly with some of the residential buildings, and we'll be working on that over the next couple months. But really, we do need to get there. And the question is, how can we get there well? And we have to take the urgency of Dr. Basu and work to make sure we address this as quickly as we can. Thanks so much, Mothers Out Front.
You're welcome. Marjorie, did you want to say something, or you had your hand up for?
No, I had my clapping hands up because I thought, I thank you so much, Seth and Gaurav, for the really great presentations that you made. And thanks everybody for coming. And I was watching the numbers and a lot of you stuck right in there all the way through. So I hope that people found it an interesting and informative session.
And I see Senator Brownsberger's got a question. No question. You're muted. I did it myself.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you, Patty, for the shout out, and thank you to everybody for the evening. And this, just to say it, I'm kind of reintroducing myself to Cambridge because I represented Cambridge previously, but with redistricting, I now represent most of West Cambridge, and all through the before in my previous representation and while I was away, and now that I'm back, climate's very central to my focus. And I just dropped in the chat a couple of items ago my link and the work I'm doing in the building space. So this is a particular focus for me, and I'm eager to hear from folks on anything that they want me to be thinking about or taking action on. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this evening. We really appreciate that. So, okay. Thanks, everybody. I hope this is you learned something and enjoyed the evening. Thank you to our presenters, and we will get information to everyone who came tonight.
Thank you. It's not easy, but it's worthwhile.
That's right. That's right. So whoever's left, Deb, how do you, the three buttons at the bottom to save the chat, I didn't work for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of computer are you on, Christine?
I'm on a Mac, and there are the three dots that say more, and it just says start focus mode.
It should just say it. What do you see? Because for me, I'm on a Mac too, and it also works on, I don't know too much about the PC world, but you should see a little thing that says format. There's a little smiley face. Do you see that?
Yeah, reactions.
You have to be on chat. You have to have your chat
You
open.
have to have your chat open. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to add that in.
Oh, I'm in the chat. There it is. Save chat. Woo,
Yeah,
thank
sorry.
you.
The very bottom of the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Good point,
got it.
Rich.
No, that was great. Thank you. I mean, I know that other people were going to save it, but I wanted to save it for myself too. And Kathy, I hope that it seemed like you had some good back and forth with Quentin and Patty. And I get, our building was the same way. We, it's one boiler for the whole building and $30,000 for each, heat pump. So
yes, it's a little different when you're 66 or 104 or 200 units. The issue is it becomes much more complex. The one I've been spending a lot of time on this. Even before it looked like we might be mandated to do it. I've been looking into it for a while.
Yeah.
Yes, I thank you very much, Kathy. My building is in pretty much in hysterics. We have 64 units, and we are all on fixed incomes or very young, or we're not rich people. And most of us are, I'm a climate activist, but that doesn't mean I have $60,000 and somewhere to go